And it's Friday night with Byline Times. I'm Peter Jukes.
And I'm Hardeep Matharu. And over the next hour, we bring you what the papers don't say.
And what the TV doesn't tell you. Now, coming up, there's a big demonstration last weekend of anti-vaxxers, COVID denialists. We'll be looking at that and also why this is spreading on social media. And we'll be joined by Kyle Taylor of the Real Facebook Oversight Board, who'll tell us exactly why these conspiracy theories proliferate on places like Facebook.
Plus, has Nigel Farage's attack on the Royal National Lifeboat Institution backfired? We'll be discussing this with Otto English to see what he has to say about this latest battle in the culture war. Then we'll be joined on the blue sofa by journalist Paul Mason, who'll be discussing his new book, How to Stop Fascism. And we'll be considering, is Britain still a fundamentally decent society?
Now, as you might have noticed last week, we're not amply funded by foreign hedge funds. In fact, we do have some technical problems, and great apologies from all of us here for the late broadcast of the show and some of the sound issues. George was all on his own that day because of staff absences, and we bought a new mixer. It cost £900, and if anybody wants to sponsor us for that mixer, we'll name the mixer after you. More importantly, you can support us by either signing up at Patreon, that's patreon.com/Byline TV, or signing up on the YouTube channel, and everything goes to make this show better. So thank you. Now, this week's digital front page, Hardeep, and what is it?
Yes, the headline is Class Action.
What's that about?
Well, you know, it's really interesting because we talk a lot about the culture war and the government's war on woke. And I think we often forget that, in a way, in Britain, the ultimate culture war has always been class. And yet we hardly ever talk about it. And that's what Otto English, who will also be on the show a bit later, that's the point he was making with the article that leads our front page this week. You know, why don't we talk about it when the class system and the hierarchy that's embedded in this country, it is very damaging and limiting to the majority of people who live here.
Do you really mean that? I mean, only 2 of the last 3 prime ministers have been members of the Bullingdon Club. So it's pretty diverse, come on. Anyway, so on to more serious matters, unfortunately. So last weekend, you may have seen there was a big demonstration in Trafalgar Square where a disgraced and now struck off former nurse, Kate Shirmani, compared the NHS staff who've dealt with COVID over the last year and a half to war criminals and effectively demanded their hanging in Nuremberg-style trials. This very disturbing phenomenon of coronavirus denial and anti-vaxxer movement, as we have reported many times, ties up with the QAnon movement in the US. It's almost a year ago, on one of the first films we ever did for Byline TV, that Hardeep here interviewed Kate Shirmani about her beliefs. We found, in further research on the longer film, that she was connected to some far right-wing groups. But first, let's go back to that interview a year ago and just warn you, it's quite disturbing what she says. And you can see that Hardeep is shocked.
So now, when I liken this to Auschwitz and the cattle trucks, you tell me the difference, because the only time in history when I can find where the nurses and the doctors were allowed to end people's lives was the nurses of the Third Reich. They took them into these places, institutions, they removed food, water, they gave them cocktails of drugs to kill them. The nurses of the Third Reich are here today, and we now have the nurses and doctors.
But where is the evidence for what you're saying, Kate, around you likening this to Auschwitz and the Holocaust, which I think a lot of people will find deeply offensive? Where is the evidence?
I don't care if they find it offensive. I find it offensive that our elderly have been murdered in care homes. Stop being a special snowflake and saying you're offended. They are killing our elderly, our most vulnerable. And I said, this is no different to the death camps. And then I called the ambulances, the cattle trucks. When I see, and I have testimonies from relatives and healthcare professionals that people have been taken into hospitals and murdered using midazolam and morphine. What else do we call it? I call it genocide. So I'm sorry, in South Africa, where men, women and children, white farmers are being slaughtered and raped. This is an agenda, you know, the Strong Cities Alliance. I believe it's called Alliance, I might be wrong, with Strong Cities, a lot of funding by George Soros. And for the, incidentally, going back to the Jewish thing, someone called me anti-Semitic. It's ridiculous, because I said that George Soros has funded Black Lives Matter, which is well known, it's documented. So I'm not anti-Jewish. I have Jewish friends. They know me well. I am science-led and I am law-led, and I have joined up with people with the same opinions. You saw Robin Tilbrook there yesterday, who's chair of the English Democrats. You saw David Curtin, who's part of the English Assembly, I believe, and he's running from there.
So Hardeep, there was a bit of pushback, a little bit of pushback about that interview, because people felt, in the shorter version as shown on Twitter, you didn't really challenge and rebut her many false statements. So what would you say about that now?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because in the time since that was filmed and people had seen it, and a lot of people saw it more recently in the past week, a lot of people commented on my composure and said that if they had been in that situation, they would have been really, really angry. And to that, there's 2 points. One, as a journalist, one has to have that skill of sort of detaching oneself. But also, I was deeply unsettled. I was really shocked by hearing this level of extremism so close. That is fundamentally a very disturbing thing. And for weeks afterwards, Kate Sharamani's words stayed with me. And the reason it was so significant to speak to her was because rebuttal is not going to work with this woman. I mean, it is far beyond that. I mean, of course, if it really would have made it clearer, I could have rebutted each point. But how would I have done that? How, to say,
you'd have to stop
actually,
every 5 seconds.
Well, yeah, and actually the doctors and the nurses now are nowhere in the same comparison as what was happening during the Third Reich. Though these are not comparable things to begin with, and by rebutting each point, you're almost giving her views a gravitas that they don't deserve. And it was just an avalanche. There was very little I could actually do. And so what I hoped to give viewers was that view that I had of her, that they were in my seat, that they could see that the reason this was so disturbing and dangerous was because you can't rebut it. It is beyond rationality. It's beyond anything that you can try to tackle.
Now, we had a debate last night with quite an established broadcasters. You should be gatekeepers, you should rebut, and that we're sort of amplifying a voice like that. I mean, I'd argue if people saw the longer film, it doesn't amplify. I don't think anybody persuaded by that. But I suppose we're going to just bring in Carl Taylor very shortly, that's the classic broadcast mode. Don't let these people say those crazy things on mainstream media, and that will stop it happen. Meanwhile, on Facebook, and she had a very successful YouTube channel, it goes unregulated. So I think we're in a different zone. How do you rebut lies which are being spread anyway? Do you bring them to the light and show their craziness?
Of course, and obviously, I think what Kate Sharamani highlights is that there are some very, very dark corners of YouTube where this radicalization is going on. People like her will be telling millions of people these sorts of beliefs which are utterly baseless. And here, obviously, the intention was never to bring her views to an audience which could potentially be influenced or affected. What we aim to do for our Byline TV viewers who know a lot about what Byline Times has done to look at radicalization, the far right, conspiracy theory movements over the past 2 years, that is what we're trying to shed light on. Just hoping that these people will be ignored and therefore just go away doesn't work. Because I was talking to her last September. A week ago, she was in Trafalgar Square. She's not just going to go.
And she'd been struck off from the nursing register in the meantime, partly because of evidence like the stuff you accumulated.
Yeah.
Let's bring in Kyle now, because he's written this fantastic book for Byline Times, the little black book of data and democracy, which obviously I'd recommend because it's Kyle and it's Byline Books. But Kyle, you've done quite a bit of research and on COVID denialism particularly, and isn't there some extraordinary amount of disinformation about coronavirus vaccines from Facebook?
Yeah, actually, it's a really interesting time, and I want to pick up on a few points that Hardeep mentioned. But what was really important about the last week is that it was Facebook's quarterly earnings call on Wednesday. And ahead of that, the Real Facebook Oversight Board, a project of all the citizens, published our own quarterly harms report. So, for investors to get a sense of what their money bought in the context of undermining democracy, spreading disinformation, and ultimately costing human lives. And one of the big pieces that we picked up on was a report published, a deeply, deeply researched report published by the Center for Countering Digital Hate, which found that over 70% of all COVID disinformation on Facebook came from just 12 accounts, wow, which they named the Disinformation Dozen.
Mm. And are they still there, Kyle? Can I just ask you? I mean, if you've tracked them down, this report has found them, are those accounts still active?
So as far as the last I checked, all of these accounts are still active. No one has been removed from the platform. And it's important to remember that the reason is that Facebook is ultimately a private business, right? They're trying to make as much money as possible. And disinformation sells. So Facebook is making a lot of money off of this false information. I mean, can you imagine the rebuke that they got from the president of the United States, whose initial message to them was, "You are killing people."
Is that what he said, Joe Biden? Just explain that to us. People might have missed that. What did Joe Biden say to Facebook?
So the report came out, and a reporter then asked Joe Biden, "Do you have a message for Facebook?" And he said, "Yeah, my message is you're killing people." Now, this is also a really important inflection point, because you'd think at the president of the United States saying that, your response might be something to we're sorry, we're going to take action. Instead, Facebook, which really speaks to their power now, said, that's cruel. We can't believe you said that. We're doing so much good work. And so this forced Biden to, quote unquote, walk back his statements where he said, "What I meant was disinformation on Facebook is killing people." And people viewed that as a walk back. And for me, I was sort of like, isn't that worse? Because what you're saying is there's a problem on your platform that you could actually do something about, but you're choosing not to, right? It's now an active choice by Facebook not to do something about this disinformation. And so what the Real Facebook Oversight Board published our report citing these stats and then making a clear demand. We're not seeking deplatforming. We're seeking the disabling of engagement on proven disinformation. How would
they do that? Is that easy for them to do? Is that something which would be complex?
This is extremely easy for them to do. And basically what we're saying is this is nothing about free speech. Fine, go ahead and post that. But no one is entitled to freedom of reach, right? You're not entitled to be able to send this information to millions of people on Facebook. And unfortunately for Facebook and also other social media companies, this has been tested. And all it means is something that's been proven to be disinformation cannot be liked, shared, or commented on, and it will be obscured with a gray box that says, "This is misleading or false information. If you want to see it, click the X." And we know from Twitter's intervention last January, it can reduce, simply disabling engagement can reduce reach by over 70% of harmful information. So you've got to ask yourself, why aren't they doing it? Well, because of the money.
Well, you think it's more money? Yeah, so just sorry to interrupt you, Carl, but that's the question. I mean, Zuckerberg met with Trump. Obviously, Trump is now banned for another 2 years or whatever. Suspended. What is driving Facebook's attitude to this deadly disinformation over a pandemic? Is it money, or do you think there's some kind of techno-libertarian right-wing sympathy that, if these people are going to destroy themselves by not taking vaccines, it's up to them? Pure libertarian freedom. Is it money or is it politics?
I mean, it could be that pure libertarian freedom. It might be, right? But through the lens of how we know companies are meant to operate, we've got to think about the money piece. And to me, that's crucial here, because they are making disinformation dollars off people's lives. And I think, Hardeep raised a really important point about, do you rebut these things? And what we know from how engagement works on social media is rebutting only adds the fuel to the fire. right? So the more you engage, and that's by design, right? The more that anybody engages with these types of posts, whether they like them or dislike them, the algorithm is going, oh, this is driving engagement. We can sell more ad space with this post, right? This is critical piece. And the ultimate goal of these platforms is not to get, let's say, the right and the left to be arguing with each other, but instead to get a little nugget from this side and drop it into this side so that this side gets in a frenzy, right? So much of activity on social media isn't having actual arguments with people. It is agreeing with other people just like you about the crazy thing that has ended up in your feed.
So we have a brilliant clip, which a film you did, for a short film you did with us and yesterday, and I think it's on social media. We'll play that again towards the end of the show. Thanks for joining us, Carl, and do come back in the studio soon with your real Facebook oversight board on hat and tell us how we tame down Zuckerberg and Facebook. Thank you, Carl.
Will do. Thanks for having me. Have a great show.
Bye. So we had another big piece on Byline Times this week, didn't we, about the role of Twitter particularly, and bot networks and inauthentic accounts boosting GB News, didn't we? Mm-hmm.
Yes, Peter. Caroline Orr, one of our American correspondents, did an investigation into bots, which we should explain, essentially fake Twitter accounts.
Semi-automated
accounts which are amplifying GB News. So we've had this sort of interesting, a couple of weeks ago we were discussing how the wheels seem to be coming off GB News, yes. But it seems like the solution to that has been to bring Nigel Farage on as a mainstream presenter, but also perhaps a shift from focusing on TV ratings, moving more towards influence on social media. And so while GB News said that it's, has no involvement with any such bots or knowledge of them, Caroline Orr did just an independent investigation through a company which sort of tracks
Bot Sentinel,
Sentinel, and saw that actually GB News was trending.
Well, top in the world. It was the top of inauthentic accounts. And this is in the same week, by the way. Everybody should realise that Nigel Farage, I think it's his second week of appearance, decided, among his various other targets in this new battle on the front on the war against woke, to take issue with the Royal National Lifeboat Institution, because it rescues migrants and various other people trapped at sea. In a moment, we'll be joined by Barto English to discuss this new battlefront in the culture wars, and amazingly, by Richard Howard, who is a oyster fisherman for 40 years and for 10 years was a volunteer with the RNLI. But before we join them, let's just look at exactly what Nigel Farage has been saying in the last week about rescuing people at sea.
A story that I've been covering, which I suppose is a byproduct of the Channel migrant crisis, surrounds the RNLI. It is to be regretted that the RNLI in Kent particularly, partly in East Sussex, increasingly is becoming a taxi service for the illegal gangs pushing migrants across into the English Channel. This obsessive, ridiculous, politically correct, nonsensical view that everything that goes wrong in the world is down to climate change and that disaster is almost upon us. I think we see with that speech how utterly farcical some of that has now become. What we are witnessing here is economic migration. And for many of these people, of course, they'll finish up effectively living in the slave trade in this country. I'm not so sure that desperate people have brand new Nike trainers, smart iPhones, or when they arrive, high-five each other or punch the air. I put it to you that actually these are economic migrants, not genuine refugees.
Well, the data just doesn't bear that out. And if you bother to look at the data, you will see that the great majority of these people show that their claims are successful, that they are refugees.
Why has Boris announced these unlawful COVID passports? Well, because I think the mad scientists are telling him that's what he's got to do. They've now got over the line into England. The French naval vessel has dumped them, and here they are. Traffickers that are taking people across the English Channel are now openly, wantonly advertising their wares on TikTok. Every single leading figure on both Leave and Remain in the referendum said that a vote to leave was to leave the single market. It couldn't have been clearer.
Well, we're joined by one of our favourite writers of Byline Times, Otto, who's written brilliantly about Farage and brilliantly about class in the front page this week. Why did GB News replace, on his temporary absence, Andrew Neil, that stalwart of BBC Broadcasting, with a guy with a slightly more checkered past, Nigel Farage?
Well, viewers. Is the answer. Should I go home now? No, I mean, they're just chasing viewers, aren't they? So they know Farage's box office.
Right.
So they know that they will get that segment of viewer in. And it works. I mean, I don't know how many listeners LBC used to get in, but it was the same time, same kind of vibe. I mean, his early moments on GB News were very similar to the LBC show that he used to have, and he did look like a sort of frozen kipper staring at the camera.
But he has pints of beer there or something. I mean, the audience figures did go up to like 70,000, but that's not huge. I mean, they beat Sky.
That was on Twitter, but did it on...
I'm talking on broadcast, but then they shrank down again.
Yeah.
So it is a boost, but they're still, way down in the ratings. But you're right, it's the Twitter outrage they enjoy, isn't it? It's activating those old culture wars. But isn't that Schiff Rightwood ultimately, it didn't work with LBC. He hasn't got a political party anymore. Is it really a good broadcast strategy? So, you expert on broadcast.
Well, it worked on LBC until he got kicked off LBC or agreed to leave LBC
right.
because he tweeted something outrageous and caused upset, as I remember it. I mean, there was an event which led to Farage leaving LBC.
Yes, I can't remember what that was.
Unfortunately, if you do that, the whole thing with them, and it's the same with Katie Hopkins to some extent, is you've got to keep fomenting the rage. You've got to keep stacking the pyre and the bonfire of rage in order to generate viewers or listeners or whatever it is. And there comes a point where do you go?
Yes, this is my question.
Yeah.
It's not a huge audience, as we've seen, the appetite for bombast and argument. And the interesting thing to me, I don't know if you noticed this, that Andrew Neil disagreed with him about the RNLI. And so what you're getting is a bit like UKIP and the Conservative Party. It's like, we have dissent between Andrew Neil and Nigel Farage, or between Tom Harwood and Lawrence Fox about vaccines. But so the debate is over there. We're not part of the debate. They're kind of shifting everything rightwards.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, Farage has become the pointer at the migrants, hasn't he? Or the asylum seekers. That has become his new thing. He goes on those day jollies down to Dover. He points at boats from a distance.
Poor people.
And now he's taken that to GB News.
Well, hold that thought, because we want to talk about the larger culture wars, boats, seas, build the wall, fortress Europe. We're joined brilliantly down the line by Richard Hayward, a oyster fisherman for more decades that I want to mention. Richard, can you hear me? I don't think he can. So we have no technical sound. Oh, he can hear me. Can you hear me now, Richard?
Yes, thank you.
Sorry, it's our technical sound end. We're getting better. First clip of the day. So, Richard, would you tell me, you were a volunteer for 10 years for the RNLI. Can you tell me what you did and what the job entailed and why you did it?
Basically, here in West Mersey, we to the inflatable life in probably the early 70s. A very much different thing to what it is now. It was a rubber boat, an outboard on the back, jackets to wear. Other than that, you went out, whatever clothes, more or less. Radios, no lights, although in those days in those boats. And you went out whenever somebody was perceived to be in danger. The boat had turned over or what.
And so you're based in West Mersey?
We went out to try and bring them back. The purpose was to save people from the sea.
And did you, obviously, that you probably saved many lives, I imagine, and you're based in West Mersey, is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, I mean, I'd say I saved many lives because there were a number of us in the crew and only 2 went at a time. But the boat over a period of time, several lives, yes.
Did you ever ask anybody when you were rescuing them where they were from?
No, there wasn't. Well, I might have just done in course of conversation, but that wasn't the important thing. The thing was to get them out to sea if they were in it, and in most cases to get them and warmer conditions, drier conditions as soon as possible.
So
and the reason they were there was not our concern.
So what did you feel when Nigel Farage, attacked? We don't have to, I know we have filmed your sons and the impact on your industry of Brexit. But what did you personally feel when you heard Nigel Farage criticising the RNLI for rescuing people at sea?
No, he was totally out of order. They rescue people from the sea, whoever they are, wherever they've come from, wherever they're going. Whether they're misguided in the fact that they are coming to this country or into Europe from, say, Africa, they're misguided in coming here in the hope of something better life or coming for political reasons. That's one thing. But I don't think any more misguided or what word to use than a lot of people who get rescued who go out in small boats and have no idea of the implications if the weather should deteriorate or something happen.
And to be fair to...
What I like there is to rescue people who need rescuing from stop.
And to be fair to, if they're asylum seekers or migrants, they often would not know the conditions of the boats they're in. There is some good news, though, isn't there, Richard? I don't know if you saw, but something like the day after Nigel Farage attacked the RNLI, £200,000 was donated to the organisation.
That's very good. I mean, like all charities, it is a charitable. They need what income they can get these days.
Well, look, thank you for joining us so much, Richard, and tell us about your experiences. I hope to speak to you again, maybe about Brexit and fishing. And we're certainly, if people can look on our YouTube channel and see the wonderful films that Byline TV did with your son. Thanks for joining us, Richard. So, I mean, if 200,000 was raised by, RNLI and contributions after Farage, maybe this culture war isn't working.
Well, the culture war always has been such a fabrication, hasn't it? And I mean, as somebody pointed out on Twitter today, and I'm sorry to always talk about Twitter, but someone pointed out on Twitter today, there's a lot of very good people in this country, and we've got so used to one side, so-called, slagging off the other, and all these culture war, vibes going on, that we forget that. And a lot of people in this country vote for normal centrist values and policies. And the idea that Farage, as he was claiming, represents real Britain or the true values of England has always been complete nonsense.
But it's an international...
It's a stronger word, though.
No, he's threatened to leave to go to America, hasn't he, if he's Brexit. By the way, you can take your earpiece now, if you like now, because they are uncomfortable, I can tell you. And, he's internationally connected with Steve Bannon. He's always going to see the AFD. He's about as British as his surname, which is Huguenot.
Well, the whole paradox of Farage is he was always a European politician.
Yeah.
He only ever got any seat in government or in the European Union because of proportional representation. Yeah. And he only ever had a seat because of his position on the European Union. Ironically, therefore, he was in the European Parliament. He couldn't win, he couldn't win school captain in a fixed vote of 8 people in a reception class.
Maybe in Dulwich School he could have done.
Maybe in Dulwich School, yes.
Like that. No, I apologise to Dulwich School.
He lacks, he doesn't speak for Britain and he doesn't speak for England. The danger is that there's a lot of people who say, we just need to ignore Farage and he'll go away. But it doesn't work like that, because if you ignore them, you just allow them to have that platform, which he has. He's now on GB News. We're sitting here talking about him, true as well. But he has to. His narrative needs to be attacked front on by people, and people have to say Farage does not represent Britain. Farage is not Britain. Farage stands for the very worst ideas of the far right, which could be anywhere in the world.
What's really interesting, I thought, was the Farage controversy around the RNLI this week is, Priti Patel. One of her main things about her new plan for immigration is this focus on boats. I mean, she has also done a number of appearances and a number of speeches and talks about this very issue. And I think it's really because the boats is the most symbolic thing, isn't it? We're our island nation. Here are the invaders coming on the boats. And I think there's some symbolism around that, which is so powerful. But it's really interesting. Farage has almost made it go mainstream. But let's not forget Priti Patel is also using that same
and the press jumped on it as well. So everyone's that's what Farage is very good at. He's very good at seizing the agenda and then creating an agenda and then getting other people to become part of it.
I don't think that's accidental, by the way. I don't have any proof of it, but the coordination. Summer, let's go down to the coast, Priti Patel, the front page of the Sunday Times, but just on the nationalism issue. Two things are quite important here. The GB News is 75% foreign owned. There it is, attacking a national institution, the RNI. Half its directors are not British residents, including Andrew Neil. And apparently in 2016, Farage did exactly the same game. And a lot of European right-wingers, if you like, were going about the Syrian migrants. So it's not just the English Channel which is a threat. But the thing that it most reminds me of is his great pal, and he'd be living in America, I suspect, had he got in, Donald Trump, and build the wall. What happened to that wall?
Well, also, what happened to Farage's poster of immigrants? And they put up that bit. Do you remember UKIP had another post? I mean, they put where they had like a stair lift going up into the White Cliffs of Dover, and they went on and on about if we left the European Union, all of this problem would magically disappear. And yet, so yes, the number of people who claim asylum by coming to the UK on a boat across the English Channel is a tiny percentage, and that's really important to stress, of the number of people who claim asylum in this country. But secondly, these very people who said that this problem, so-called, and I say so-called because I don't think people claiming asylum is a problem, that the problem would go away if we left the European Union. There it is. It's still going on. In fact, sea crossings are up. So arguably it's worse because we have taken back control of our borders. So we've created more of an issue, and France, presumably, is less likely willing to help to some extent. But I was also reading today that if they just seal down that shorter distance, the people smugglers will just start heading south, and you'll have more dangerous journeys coming into further west into England, and probably more deaths. So you will probably just shift the problem south, but they'll still come because people who are seeking asylum in such desperate measures will take a desperate course of action. Yeah.
I think it's always good to have a bit of positivity as well. We like to give our viewers occasionally. And I think it's really interesting that this has come just a few weeks after Priti Patel being called out by Tyrone Mings, the England player, about the racism faced by the 3 England players who missed penalties and how she'd called them taking the knee gesture politics. You know, just a few weeks after that, we've had Farage taking this big stand against an institution that actually a lot of people respect and a lot of people care about. And anyone who's seen, this is a good side of social media, that brilliant video from the RNLI saying this is why we do our work. And look at these people. Did they look like people who are sort of coming here to have a good time? They're making a journey, which is so dangerous. I think that's really significant. But on both of these fronts, the culture war is on shakier ground, I would say.
And Yeah?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would like the media to be interviewing some of, I suppose it's impossible because they go through a process, but I would like to hear the voices of those people coming across.
Well, there's a great guy, and I watched Led by Donkeys did a video. We tried to get him on tonight, but his moving house, Hassan Patel, who I've met, and what it means to him. And if you look at Germany, they've taken this amazing 1 million Syrian migrants, and they've got this amazing workforce now, loyal to the country. And that's, before we move on and talk to Paul Mason, it's worth remembering the decent side of the British people, whatever the politics is going on, whatever the media, whatever the governance. And last week, you may have not heard it because of our sound issues, but Bonnie Greer, American by birth and had lived in the UK for 30 years, made a very interesting point about how decent the British people are. And we'll be talking about that to Paul Mason and his new book, How to Stop Fascism. And you'll see clips of the two of them coming up.
Something that the American people fundamentally are. British people are decent and fundamentally decent. Americans aren't fundamentally decent. I mean, we're nice people, good people, strong people, brave people. Decency means seeing somebody in trouble and they move to help. No matter if you are a stranger or what, a British person will do that automatically, in my experience. An American will not.
Why? Because of fear?
I think it's just, that's a good question. I think it's, Americans are very afraid of weakness and, frailty and inability to do something. It's a thing that happens. Americans are very kind, but they aren't decent, whereas the British are decent. And I think that's the thing that's going to get the country through.
They blow up a tower block and it explodes from the bottom, and the top bit stays more or less normal until it hits the ground. That's what's happening to British politics.
We're joined by Paul Mason.
We've seen this week are dramatic events of substance.
And it was deeply unpleasant, Paul.
You supply me with no evidence. Those of you, who'll be still alive in the 2050s will be reaping the rewards of putting a right-wing conservative racist government into power.
What do you make of the strategy that Boris Johnson seemed to be employing?
Well, I recognise that language, traitor, surrender, betrayal, because it's the language that a group of fascists and football hooligans shouted at me. And as a result, Mr Cameron, who's signalled his resignation but has not yet gone, will go down in history as the Conservative leader who, first of all, destroyed the European Union. He's going to destroy the United Kingdom as well. The problem we have is we have a culture war. Lists of foreign workers who we're going to expel from the British workforce. That played quite well among some racist voters.
By Paul Mason. Paul, thanks for coming back.
Good evening.
Great to have you. Now, just before we get onto your book, How to Stop Fascism, do you agree with what Bonnie Greer was saying about Britain? That fundamentally, it's a decent society, people are very kind and generous, and that perhaps these days we just forget that a bit too much?
Look, I think it's during the lockdown and during the COVID-19 pandemic, I think people have been quite kind to each other, and I think that we can appreciate that. I just think my experience as a journalist is that the kindness. Britain is quite an edgy and cruel society, and I would say that's true of all communities as well. I'm just aware that that people are so much on their own resources. In other words, I'm not talking about evil here. I'm talking about the fact that people are thrown to their own resources, their own family, their own town, their own village, and in a situation of stress, they find it quite difficult to find the generosity. The generosity is sufficient to meet what Bonnie's saying there in terms of that kind of society.
So it's kind of generosity as a luxury, if you have the resources for it. And would you say, because we haven't spoken since the Euro final, we saw some of that darkness and cruelty as well as the generosity and light.
Well, look, the Euros final and indeed the Euros themselves were, for me, a worked example of the government trying. I mean, it was the government. It wasn't just the far right. It wasn't just Nigel Farage you've been talking about. The government tried to stir up a very nasty culture war. It was something they were, and if it had worked, because we know what it looked like because it didn't work, and what it looked like was an outpouring of support for the three guys, an outpouring of a kind of self-created Englishness that looked good for once. But if Johnson and Priti Patel and the Tory backbenchers had had their way, they would have had a mob of screaming xenophobes, baying for the blood of the English team for being useless.
But yeah, that happened. That happened on Seychelles.
It did, but it wasn't big enough. It didn't achieve critical mass for them. And in fact, it backfired on them. And it backfired on them in a way that I think they're politically worried about, because we saw both in the Batley by-election and in that the by-election in South East England where the Lib Dems won, we saw decent people, the sort of decent middle-class Lib Dem Tory voting people going, I don't like this. And I think they're going to be up against that quite a lot in the next 18 months.
But just as a point of interest, a Welsh friend of mine was in Trafalgar Square during the penalty shootout, and it was carnage. And I heard anecdotally every person of colour left when the penalties were missed.
That's interesting, and I think that it's clearly locality by locality. Community by community, that story is still yet to be told. We probably we haven't picked up the pieces of that carnage. But fundamentally, I came away from the start of the Euros. I wrote a piece saying, look, this is playing with fire. For the Tories to stir a culture war against Britain's black players taking the knee, and their white colleagues supporting them, they don't realise, because the Tories don't go down to the kind of worst Weatherspoons in the world, and they don't really rub shoulders with the kind of people I'm writing about in the book, who I went undercover with on the Churchill demo, the people who are quite happy to stand, ex-servicemen, quite happy to stand against a German army flag from the Second World War, and not take issue with the person carrying it. The Tories don't know really that is the fire they're playing with. And so I was gratified. It was gratifying to see during that it was a journey, wasn't it? It was a journey. We tried this way, and then they tried it again, and then they backed off from sort of criticising the taking the knee, and then the nation got behind the team, so it backfired on them.
But there's a moment, wasn't there, where Priti Patel was pictured rather unnaturally supporting the team, and Boris Johnson with a weird shirt on, where they thought when we did well, because you're not in control of the football game, that they could co-opt it.
You know what I was thinking about when Boris Johnson did that? I mean, in the book I'm talking about, the historical part of the book is the March on Rome, Mussolini's March on Rome. Yeah. Mussolini famously had these black shirts, and there were violent attack squads to kill and maim workers and peasants. And they wore the black shirt, which was an army-style shirt from the First World War. And when he went to Rome to seize power, and the king handed him power, he declared publicly that he was going to go in street-fighting garb, in the black shirt. But on his way in the railway carriage, he put on a tailcoat. So Mussolini arrived in Rome for the March on Rome in a fighting black shirt and a tailcoat. And when I saw Boris Johnson, I thought, hold on a minute, maybe that's what he's trying to do. He's trying to mix and match the styles. He's got his suit jacket, he's got the English shirt, and then he's got a tie underneath it. I mean, I don't know whether it's a studied ineptitude with Johnson, ever.
But begs the question, going back to your book and the research you've been doing and what you talked about briefly before on this show, do you see proto-fascism here?
Well, look, we're at a moment where we've got political science categories of authoritarian conservatism, Johnson, or the Republican Party. We've got populism, Nigel Farage, you've just seen a nice clip of him. And then we've got fascism, far-right extremism, we have to call it sometimes because of our libel laws, where the people who came up to me in 2019 during the Brexit crisis, jabbing their fingers in my face, saying, we've researched you, you're a Marxist, you're a traitor to our country, they're fascists. Right.
But that language, Marxist, sorry, just been sorry, is used now generally by Tory MPs. BLM
absolutely.
are Marxists.
This is the point of my book. When what's happened to the populist right, so the Democratic Football Lads Alliance, who were on that Churchill demo, is that 10 years ago they would have been saying, we don't like migrants, their food smells funny, and they're taking our jobs. Now they're worried about Walter Benjamin. Now they're worried about Marxism. And when somebody like that is coming up to you on the street and saying, Paul Mason, you are a Marxist, I mean, that tells you what? That right-wing populism, which we thought was a kind of firewall against real fascism, because after all, Farage did divert a lot of racism and xenophobia into the parliamentary channels. It's no longer, well, the firewall is on fire. All over the world, Trump, rather than a firewall against the ultra-far right, white supremacists, is an accelerator of it. No, we've got to get our heads, proto-fascism is not a word I like. What we've got to do is get our heads around this problem of the dissolved boundaries between three political categories, and to understand that what my book is about is what is the thought architecture, because you just referred to it, the thought architecture that they are beginning to share. And once we understand that, we can fight it better, because I find even people in politics, but especially young people not that political, they don't really understand what they're dealing with when they look at a far-right extremist and the danger that we run by allowing far-right extremism to set the agenda.
Before Hadi might have a question, just while it's in my mind, what's happening to the left. I mean, Batley and Spen was a key moment, I thought, activating George Galloway, who's using some of these populist tropes. Is that... one thing I've noticed ever since the Leveson debate, right, with the press, is any form of regulation is called state control. And so when you had various people attacking lawyers, it seems the right are now calling regulation and law and order Marxism, which is a very well, whatever.
Masks are Marxist. This is the latest. One of my contacts said, look, throughout rural southeast England, masks are seen as Marxist. So this is an American trope that comes straight from the Trump movement, from the QAnon movement, the anti-vax movement. But let's understand why. I mean, I am a Marxist and a pretty hardcore one. But let's understand there's not many of us. Why? Where does the cultural Marxist trope come from? The attack. It's this. In the 30s, one of the reasons the Nazis targeted Jewish people was because they had cast them in their mythology as the carriers of the disease of Marxism. Now today, the carriers of the disease of social justice are feminists, lesbian and gay rights, transgender activists,
people of colour,
and indeed,
and you,
and me, and black footballers. Yeah. So you could, if you know how to read the fascist agenda, you could read everything, every part of it except the ultimate part, which is genocide and catastrophic civil war. But all the other bits, that the importation of an alien tradition into our national culture, well, that was taking the knee. And that was the language that allowed Johnson and Priti Patel and all the rest of them, and Farage and the ultra-right to all knowingly share the same agenda on that. And what I'm trying to do in the book is to educate people about what the fascist thought architecture is, because it's not our natural one. It's got no basis in reality.
It's not party aligned either. It's sort of free floating, isn't it?
No, it is something that is deeply rooted in the philosophical roots of the far right pre-1914, in Nietzschean irrationalism, in anti-science, which to be a scientific racist, you have to effectively be an anti-scientist. To be the equivalent now, of course, is evolutionary psychology, which says women are naturally subservient. So that's the other thing they've got going for them. Anti-science and irrationalism plus power worship. So you have to understand that the revival of this Nazi jurist Carl Schmitt, now quite talked about at polite dinner parties. Carl Schmitt, who ran Jewish people out of academia and the law in Nazi Germany, is now seen as some kind of paradigm of how we understand the state. That, to me, is fascism's theory of history, its theory of justice, its theory of struggle, and it is a theory. Young fascists today on the internet are taught theory. On the left, I can tell you, young left-wingers are not taught that much theory, and we need to remedy that as well.
And Paul, those who say that it's actually too extreme to compare Donald Trump or Boris Johnson administration to fascism, or to say that it is fascistic in its elements. Where do you think that pushback comes from?
Trump is not a fascist, but he is a work in progress. Some of his key lieutenants, Bannon and Flynn, did move towards the extreme right after they left office. I'm quite happy to say Trump is not a fascist, as long as you understand that modern fascism doesn't want a march on Rome. It doesn't want to seize power tomorrow. It wants somebody like Trump in power, and Trump creates the space for them to do what they do, which is symbolic violence, such as we saw on January the 6th, such as we saw in Charlottesville. And symbolic violence is there to teach many people what to do when Day X arrives. Day X is the big ethnic global civil war that they imagine will happen. And so the question of is he or is he not a fascist, or should we use words like fascist, is an irrelevance. There is a fascist process, and if you were to fast rewind to Germany around about 1932, you'd find a figure just like Rupert Murdoch, Alfred Hugenberg, who ran the DNVP, the German National People's Party, which had 14%, and it was a sitting pretty with millions of marks behind it. What happened? Its vote just vanished to the Nazis. Because it turned out that these right-wing populist figures in history are only staging posts. And we must remember that. We cannot believe that the far right can never gain that critical mass.
A great warning, and a great book which comes out in August, I believe.
26th of August.
I've got my first copy, I'll be reading it. Paul, could you stay a bit for some Q&A?
Absolutely, yeah.
Brilliant. So there's so many, it's such a deep, dark, important subject. We'll carry on talking with it after we go for those who subscribe. So do join us if you can by subscribing to our Patreon link. That's patreon.com/Byline TV, or on YouTube.
Yes, and we hope tonight that some of the technical issues that we've faced have been ironed out. But if you think they haven't, please do get in touch, because, you know, this is your TV channel. That's what we're trying to create here. So if you still think that you can't quite hear us, or, you know, there are other big improvements that are necessary, then please do get in touch. And with your continued support, we can keep dealing with those. But for now, thank you, Paul. And it's goodbye, and we'll see you next week. Thank you very much for watching.
See you next week or after the break.
Imagine the Nazis invent a time machine, and towards the end of the war, they decide to send a crack team of SS men into the future to restart the Reich. What year do you think they aim for?
I think tomorrow's going to be one of the greatest wins in the history of politics.
Suppose they arrive in 2020. They love our technology, they hate our culture, but then they see far-right mobs in Delhi beating students with iron bars. They see the Mussolini era used as a playbook by men like Putin and Bolsonaro. They see the Proud Boys storm the Capitol. And then they realise all the ideas in their heads, white supremacy, leader worship, violent misogyny, and the desire for genocide, are there in the heads of millions of people. So what do these time-travelling Nazis do next? I think they buy popcorn and just watch. Their mission was pointless. Fascism is back, but of its own accord.
In How to Stop Fascism, award-winning journalist Paul Mason warns a second fascist era is possible. He tells the story of anti-fascists in the 1930s, when both the political centre and the left failed to spot the danger, and calls for a new militant democracy to meet the far-right threat today.
The book is not a catalogue of far-right groups and their crimes. It's an explanation of the thought architecture they share with millions of people, of how fascism has been regrown from its ideological roots, how it's spreading via conspiracy theories and networked activism, and how to fight it. Why fascism happened was a good question for historians. Why it's happening again has to be the urgent question for all of us.
How to Stop Fascism. History, Ideology, resistance.